Wisdom Through Action is a contemporary sea-influenced school teaching the work of personal inner development in the system brought to the Western world by G.I. Gurdjieff and P.D. Ouspensky. Mr. Ouspensky said, "The most important ideas and principles of this system do not belong to me. This is chiefly what makes them valuable, because if they belonged to me, they would be like all other theories invented by ordinary minds." What he meant was that this system comes from higher mind, from conscious influence. It is an objective system to bring a man to awakening.
Welcome to Wisdom Through Action. I'm your host, Kay Smith, along with Cal Gorham. With today's show, we will be examining the influences that esoteric schools have had across the centuries. Now, I have to tell you, this was quite a challenging show to put together. We don't want to simply be regurgitating historical information to you. Our intention is to show how miraculous it is that esoteric schools, that is, men and women who developed themselves to the point that they became under the influence of higher mind, cultivated a teaching that matched the need of each civilization. The shape and the style of the school may have changed. However, the essence of the knowledge being taught remained constant.
Even before recorded history, we can find traces of esoteric school teachings on the walls of the Lascaux caves in France. When you first look at the images, you can see animals drawn in different ways, docile, in combat, alone, or with other animals. However, when you take a closer look, you notice a variety of antlers or horns drawn delicately on their heads. These antlers or horns allegorically represent levels of being. The more antlers or horns the animal has, the higher the level of being. These drawings, which are reported to be 17,000 years old, allude to the existence of higher knowledge that was available to man in this part of the world. We know that Egypt played quite an influential part in the development of several civilizations. There is an artistic representation of different levels of being in the Egyptian culture, as well as what was drawn on the caves in France, as can be seen in this Egyptian artifact, showing a school in which different levels of being are indicated by the size of the figures and the symbols on the figures. You can also see the school depicted receiving influences from higher school, as represented by the sun rays extended down with hands on the ends containing the key of life. The sphinx was the emblem of the learned society Al-Khatan and was called conscience, which means with science. It represented an allegorical being. Each part was composed of a being or animal that in their minds had perfected one or another being function. The main mass of the body of the sphinx is represented by the trunk of a bull. The trunk of the bull rested on the four legs of a lion. To the back of the bull's trunk was attached two large wings of the eagle. Fixed to the front of the bull's trunk by means of a piece of amber were two breasts, representing the breasts of a virgin. This allegorical figure was the emblem of the society Akhaldan, and served for all its members as a stimulus constantly to remind and awaken in them the corresponding influences attributed to this figure. It was designed to give a psychological shock to each member of the society, to each of their three independent parts, namely, firstly in the body, the instinctive moving brain; secondly in the thoughts, the intellectual brain; thirdly in the feeling center, the emotional brain. These shocks gradually helped the person be rid of those undesirable factors present in them and in each one of us, both those transmitted to us by heredity, as well as those acquired by ourselves personally, which are not natural or normal to us. The Sphinx constantly reminds us that it is possible to attain freedom if we always think, feel, and act according to that which is embodied in the allegorical figure. The trunk of the bull representing strength for hard work reminds us that in order for us to overcome our tendencies to have bad impulses or feelings towards others, we can overcome them only by huge effort and labor, namely those efforts which the strength of the bull in us is particularly fitted. The trunk rests on the legs of a lion. This means that the efforts or labors carried out by our bull need be performed with cognizance and feelings of courage and faith in one's strength, the strength of the sort that is possessed by the king of beasts, the mighty lion. The wings of the strongest and the highest soaring of all the birds, the eagle, attached to the bull's trunk, constantly remind us that during the efforts and labors performed with strength, courage, faith, cognizance, and self-respect, it is necessary to think continually on the questions and ideas higher than ordinary life. As regards breasts of a virgin, this expresses that love should predominate always and in everything as we work on ourselves, and that the breasts are attached to the bull's trunk with amber signifies that this love should be impartial.
The ancestral civilization of our Western culture is evidently Greek. We only know from legends the identities of the conscious men who, about the beginning of the 6th century BC, conceived the first true civilization in Europe. There's a half-legendary Solon, referred to by Plato. We are able to trace much of the beginning of philosophy to Pythagoras. Pythagoras is often referred to as the first pure mathematician. He was born in Samos, Greece, and was well educated and interested in mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and music. He left Samos for Egypt in 535 BC to study with the priests in the temples.
Many of the practices of the society he created later in Italy can be traced to these Egyptian priests. So approximately 10 years later, the country of Persia invaded Egypt, and Pythagoras was taken prisoner and sent to Babylon, where he met the Magi, the Persian priests, who taught him their sacred rites. So after several years, Pythagoras was freed, and he eventually settled in Crotona, a Greek colony in Italy, where he and the students of his esoteric school related music and mathematics together. He learned how harmonious the vibrations of strings were when they sounded in whole number intervals or whole number proportions, such as 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 4 to 5, etc. And he actually rediscovered an anciently known law, the law of octaves, as it relates to music. And this law of octaves is a universal law, which we will talk about in a later program.
So in addition to Pythagoras, there's Socrates. And Socrates developed a method of teaching called the Socratic method, which most of you are familiar with. And this is a debate form in which inquiry and debate between individuals with opposing points of view. And it's based on asking and answering questions. And the Socratic method is actually designed to stimulate critical thinking and open the mind to opposing or different points of view. And it's said, when you read up on the background behind the Socratic method, there's a story that Socrates began this method after a friend of his went to the Oracle of Delphi, and the Oracle confirmed that no one in Greece was wiser than Socrates. And Socrates, of course, saw this as a paradox, and so he began using the Socratic method after this happened.
Socrates wanted to change the mind of the youth of Athens, and that is to allow them to think for themselves, to think differently, to open their minds. And he proved that in order to be true to the principles of conscientious action, there's the highest thing for a person to do. And he proved this because he was put to death in 399 BC after a trial in which he was convicted by the people of Athens of corrupting the youth and of impiety through not acknowledging the gods of the city. He had a chance to recant his beliefs and to publicly denounce himself, but in good conscience he found that he could not, and he did not save his own life.
There are some sayings of Socrates that you might be familiar with. For example, the unexamined life is not worth living, or wonder is the beginning of wisdom. To find yourself, think for yourself, or be kind, for everyone you know is fighting a hard battle.
So a student of Socrates, Plato, was the philosopher who began the academy in Athens, which was the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. Plato wrote much of what we know about Socrates, and his dialogues included many, many teachings, the teachings of philosophy, logic, objective art, literature, justice, virtue, ethics, rhetoric, and mathematics, and many other things which are now part of our idea of philosophy. Because the Greeks were the root of our civilization, many of these ideas have been handed down to us. When Socrates died, Plato went to Samos also to study with the Egyptian priests in their temples. One of the interesting things, which we may also do a show about here in Wisdom Through Action, are the Platonic solids. And these are quite interesting forms. Plato wrote about them in his dialogue in Timaeus, in which he associated them with the four classical elements, earth, air, fire, and water, and with the ether, or quintessence. So each of these had a regular solid associated with it. And the five Platonic solids fit into one another, and it's a model of the universe with the sun in the center.
Now, it wouldn't be complete without reading to you some version of Plato's allegory of the cave. So I'm going to read from Tertium Organum, which is one of Ouspensky's first books. It starts off, a remarkable attempt to portray our relation to the nominal world, to that great life, is found in Book 7 of Plato's Republic. Behold, human beings living in a sort of underground den. They have been there from their childhood, and have their legs and necks chained. The chains are arranged in such a manner as to prevent them from turning round their heads. At a distance, and above and behind them, the light of a fire is blazing, and between the fire and the prisoners there is a raised way, and you will see, if you look, a low wall built along the way like the screen which marionette players have before them, over which they show the puppets. Imagine men passing along the wall carrying vessels, which appear over the wall. Also figures of men and animals made of wood and stone and various materials. And some of the passengers, as you would expect, are talking, and some of them are silent. That is a strange image, he said, and they are strange prisoners. Like ourselves, I replied, and they see only their shadows, or the shadows of one another, which the fire throws on the opposite wall of the cave. True, he said, how could they see anything but the shadows if they were never allowed to move their heads? And of the objects which are being carried in like manner, they would only see the shadows? Yes, he said. And if they were able to talk with one another, would they not suppose that they were naming what was actually before them? Very true. And suppose further that the prison had an echo which came from the other side. Would they not be sure to fancy that the voice which they heard was that of a passing shadow? No question, he replied. There can be no question, I said, that the truth would be to them just nothing but the shadows of the images. That is certain. And now look again and see how they are released and cured of their folly. At first, when any one of them is liberated and compelled suddenly to go up and turn his neck around and walk and look at the light, he will suffer sharp pains. The glare will distress him, and he will be unable to see the realities of which his former state he had seen the shadows. And then imagine someone saying to him that what he saw before was an illusion, but that now he is approaching real being and has a truer sight and vision of more real things. What will his reply be? And you may further imagine that his instructor is pointing to the objects as they pass and requiring him to name them. Will he not be in a difficulty? Will he not fancy that the shadows which he formerly saw are truer than the objects which are now shown to him? Far truer. And if he is compelled to look at the light, will he not have a pain in his eyes, which will make him turn away to take refuge in the object of vision which he can see, and which he will conceive to be clearer than the things which are now being shown to him? True, he said. And suppose once more that he is reluctantly dragged up a steep and rugged ascent, and held fast, and forced into the presence of the sun himself. Do you not think that he will be pained and irritated, and when he approaches the light he will have his eyes dazzled, and will not be able to see any of the realities which are now affirmed to be the truth? Not all in a moment, he said. He will require to get accustomed to the sight of the upper world, and first he will see the shadows best, next the reflections of men and other objects in the water, and then the objects themselves. Next, he will gaze upon the light of the moon and the stars, and he will see the sky and the stars by night, better than the sun. Or the light of the sun by day? Certainly. And at last he will be able to see the sun, and not mere reflections of him in the water, but he will see him as he is in his own proper place, and not in another. And he will contemplate his nature, certainly. And after this he will reason that the sun is he who gives the seasons and the years, and is the guardian of all that is in the visible world, and in a certain way the cause of all things which he and his fellows have been accustomed to behold? Clearly, he said, he would come to the other first, and to this afterwards. And when he remembered his old habitation, and the wisdom of the den, and his fellow prisoners, do you not suppose that he would felicitate himself on the change, and pity them? Certainly he would. And if they were in the habit of conferring honors on those who were quickest to observe and remember and foretell which of the shadows went before, and which followed after, and which were together, do you think that he would care for such honors and glories, or envy the possessors of them? Would he not say with Homer, "Better to be a poor man and have a poor master, and endure anything, than to think and live after their manner"? Yes, he said, I think that he would rather suffer anything than live after their manner. Imagine once more, I said, that such a one coming suddenly out of the sun were to be replaced in his old situation. Is he not certain to have his eyes full of darkness? Very true, he said. And if there were a contest, and he had to compete in measuring the shadows with the prisoners who have never moved out of the den, during the time that his sight is weak and before his eyes are steady, and the time which would be needed to acquire this new habit of sight might be very considerable, would he not be ridiculous? Men would say of him that up he went and down he comes without his eyes, and that there was no use in even thinking of ascending. And if anyone tried to loose another and lead him up to the light, let them only catch the offender in the act, and they would put him to death. No question, he said. This allegory, I said, you may now append to the previous argument. The prison is the world of sight. The light of the fire is the sun. The ascent and vision of the things that you may truly regard as upward progress of the soul into the intellectual world. And you will understand that those who attain to this blessed vision are unwilling to descend to human affairs, but their souls are ever hastening into the upper world in which they desire to dwell. Well, we live still under the influence. We still see, like Plato's allegory of the cave, only the reflection of things, so that what we see has lost all reality. We must realize how often we are governed and controlled not by things themselves, but by our idea of things, our view of things, our picture of things. And just think, Plato wrote this allegory how many hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and it still applies.
The Greeks used drama and music for the main transmission of their ideas, and the use of theater was quite strong with them too. The Eleusinian mysteries and the other mystery schools used theater in their exposition of esoteric knowledge. Pythagoras developed the inner laws of harmony and worked out the manifestations for a new architecture and a new music. And the combined result of all this for the Greek civilization 2,500 years ago was an entirely new civilization. And this culture attracted the best and the brightest from across the continents. Socrates, Plato, Pythagoras, all these men and women worked over the years to hold the growth of the highest part of this civilization together. But like any organism, any living thing, a civilization becomes old and decrepit and eventually dies. So the Greek world, after a certain number of years of being at its height, began to degrade and shrink and stoop like an old man.
So if you think of your history, next comes the rise of the Roman Empire. It is unknown how it came about. However, there were two esoteric schools that greatly influenced the Roman civilization. These were Samos, the school of Epicurus, and the school of Stoics. Roman life and culture was much different than the Greek world. The Greeks had beautiful impressions, drama, and music, and the Romans had more useful and practical tools, such as the aqueducts for moving water and an intricate system of roads for moving trade. And as it turned out, the organization of the roads and the order that the Roman Empire required ended up with a greater empire than the Greek civilization it had overthrown.
So to start with, Epictetus the Stoic was born a slave around AD 55, and he was a student of Gaius Musonius Rufus. Now, Rufus, his works included arguments in favor of equal treatment of women and against the double standard in marriage. And Epictetus became Rufus's most acclaimed student and was eventually granted his freedom from slavery. Epictetus taught in Rome till about 94 AD. So some of Epictetus's questions, and the Stoics in general, asked, how do I live a happy, fulfilling life? How can I be a good person? These were Epictetus's burning questions, as they're the burning questions of many people. And his work was in the form of a manual for living.
So Epictetus believed that the primary job of philosophy is to help ordinary people deal with the challenges of everyday life and to deal with life's inevitable major losses, disappointments, and griefs. His was a moral teaching, stripped of sentimentality, piousness, and metaphysical mumbo-jumbo. In his teaching on the art of living, there's a philosophy of inner freedom and tranquility, of way of life whose purpose is to lighten our hearts. He views such things as professional achievement, wealth, power, and fame as incidental and irrelevant to true happiness. And what matters most is what sort of person you are becoming, what sort of life you are living.
So probably the most famous of the Roman Stoics was the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. He said he was like to quote Plato, "States will never be happy until rulers become philosophers and philosophers rulers." So Marcus Aurelius spent much of his life on military campaign in the north against the Germans, and he was known as one of the 5 good emperors. Indeed, if we seek a good example, a perfect example of Plato's philosopher ruler in the flesh, we could hardly do better than Marcus Aurelius. He ruled the Roman Empire for almost 2 decades, and he was a student of the Stoics, and specifically of Epictetus. Marcus Aurelius wrote a certain number of volumes of work which he called simply To Myself. They were notes to himself, which he wrote while on military campaign. And they were notes on how he can live the best life possible, how he could live a good life. And many years later, these notes were discovered and published under the title Meditations.
Now, the questions that meditation tries to answer are primarily the metaphysical ones, such as why are we here, how should we live our lives, how can we ensure that what we do is right, how should we deal with pain and misfortune. He was a philosopher emperor who lived the principles that he held so high. And of some of the principles he adhered to were 3 disciplines. Everywhere, at each moment, you have certain options. The first one is to accept the event with humility or with will. The next one is to treat the person as he or she should be treated, and that's with action. And the third and final one is to approach each thought with care so that nothing irrational creeps in, and that's seen as using perception.
You can see in the School of Athens, painted by Raphael during the Renaissance, many of the esoteric teachers we have mentioned thus far. Pythagoras, number 6. Socrates, number 12. Plato, number 14. And many others, including Hypatia, whom we will talk about next. She is represented as number 9. Hypatia became the recognized teacher and head of the Neoplatonist school of philosophy at Alexandria, Egypt, in 400 AD, and in charge of the Library of Alexandria. She wrote a number of books on mathematics, and she symbolized learning, science, mathematics, and astronomy. She invented a mechanical device called a plane astrolabe, an instrument used by Greek astronomers to determine the position of the sun and stars. In a recent movie about her life, called Agora, It indicates her studies on the conic sections and the discovery of the elliptical orbits of the planets around the Sun. She also helped develop a brass hydrometer, which measured the specific gravities of liquids, and a hydroscope, which was used to observe objects submerged in water. She is said to have been a highly intelligent woman, welcomed into a man's academic world due to her intelligence and presence.
At the point of the maturity of the Roman world, Jesus Christ enters into the picture as the next teacher and esoteric school influence. Within a few years, the formation of his immediate circle of 12 disciples and the Acts of the Apostles, new knowledge, ideals, and organization spread throughout the whole Eastern Mediterranean.
Unlike the temples and roads of the previous cultures of the Greeks and Romans, the monument of this civilization impacting the world was a book. It was an idea. The book, of course, was the New Testament. And the influence that this had in its early stages was a metaphysical one of extraordinary importance. The early Christian civilization reached its maturity with the recognition of Christianity by Imperial Rome around AD 320. Early Christian civilization embraced the world and then began, as did the Greeks and the Romans before it, to decline and degenerate. So 8 centuries from its inception, 8 centuries after Jesus Christ, the papacy, which was the highest temporal embodiment of early Christian civilization, was an object of commercial haggling on the Roman market, and thus early Christian civilization died.
Now, as a result of the increase in outward violence and the fall of Rome, schools took a different turn. Saint Benedict founded Monte Cassino, a monastery where, in a small, closed circle, everything was reconstructed in a new form for a new age. This ushered in the birth of the monastic Christian civilization, one which had to thrive behind the church, in the monastery, and during the Dark Ages. Monasteries were allowed to be self-sufficient and left alone to live in their own miniature world, a microcosm within itself. This allowed all that was valuable from the past to be kept.
The monks worked to preserve the Greek and Roman manuscripts. The secrets of music and medicine were kept safe in the monasteries. And the monks worked to preserve order and to bring harmony and beauty to their lands. Through their perseverance, they were able to take the first effective steps against the violence and anarchy which had racked the lands for years. And their teaching, or the truths of God, began to set rules and terms for fighting or going to war. In order to control the rebellious barons and knights who were terrorizing the countryside, the First Crusade was launched.
Like all previous ways of life, the monastic life also became corrupt and declined. Decadence became evident, and monasteries became controlled by secular powers. The Holy Roman Empire separated from Rome, and the end of the monastic Christian civilization was at hand. Esoteric schools once again go out into the world, and medieval Christian civilization is born.
The great European cathedrals of the Middle Ages are among the finest architectural achievements of all time. Esoteric school teaching, working through the school of Freemasons, created the great cathedrals, which are actually objective books built of stone and glass. Sculptures and images encompassed in the design of the cathedral, both inside and out, represented a tool to be used as a book, instructing in more inner, personal aspects of the teaching, such as strengths, weaknesses, features, and other mechanical aspects of each student. The builders of the cathedrals intertwined basic universal laws into the architectural design. For example, in this clip we learn how the Notre Dame was specifically designed, linking mathematics to music in the structures, referred to as the golden section.
By the Middle Ages, architects and composers were linking the mathematics of music and the structures they built. One architectural measurement, the golden section, can be translated into an interval called the major sixth. This is the music of the nautilus shell and breeding rabbits. Different measurements correspond to different sounds. listen to the architecture of Notre Dame.
People would go to the cathedrals, and they had a full-time choir. I think it was 60 people in Notre Dame singing music made up of the intervals that were the same as the intervals, as the proportions that actually composed the building. The buildings were designed literally to embody musical intervals, the musical tones, the musical intervals, say a third or a fifth or a fourth. Those were ratios that were taken from music and transposed literally into buildings.
The relationship between structures and sounds suggests that mathematics are essential to man's creation of beauty. But numbers cannot explain it all.
Meanwhile, the incubation of the Renaissance has been at work under the hand of Cosimo de' Medici. Cosimo de' Medici gathered together the classical antiquities, the statues, manuscripts, and works of art that were being unearthed, and opened the first public library in Europe in 1440. His foresight further saw the inevitable demise of Constantinople to the Turks, and arranged to have the emperor, pope, and assembly come to his home in Florence, rather than staying in Constantinople. When the cultural city of the world moved from Constantinople to Florence, school also moved to Florence. This timeless work of art is more than simply a religious painting. It is actually a scientific representation of the world. In it you can see the law of three, as well as the law of seven, or law of octaves, which we will go into more in depth later. Cosimo's famous Platonic Academy produced incredibly beautiful works by Botticelli, Raphael, Michelangelo, Da Vinci, and many others.
This next reading is from The Theory of Celestial Influence by Rodney Collin. So culture is born from culture, each fathered by seed from some alien but esoteric source. The medieval by new knowledge from the Arab world, the Renaissance by savants driven west at the fall of Byzantium, the new civilization of our own day by release of ancient wisdom from India and Tibet. For those concerned, the birth of a new civilization must over and over again in history have meant that everything had to be reconstructed. Everything had to be made over again from the beginning, in a new form, suitable to a new age. Looking back from our standpoint over the whole descent of history, we can see that each new beginning was in reality but a tremendous effort to continue. There was no beginning, but only a continuation of the life of humanity. To those who had to begin to engender a new phase of human development, this beginning was life or death. But from the point of view of the stars, nothing was altered, because humanity and all its potentialities remain the same. The more we study this cycle of past civilizations, the more urgently we are faced by the question, what is our civilization? What are its characteristics? How can it develop? Are we assisting at a new birth or only at an obvious death? These questions are very difficult to answer. For seen clearly, decay very often looks like progress, and progress like decay. Just as a spring day and an autumn day may for a moment be indistinguishable. Yet if we look back, we see that we do indeed live in a different world from that which existed 100 years ago. Different in ideals, expression, understanding, interests, possibilities, and in every other way. And if we take a generation of culture as between 300 and 400 years, and the birth of the Renaissance civilization as about 1450 AD, then again it becomes clear that a new age should already have dawned for us. But when did it begin? How is it recognizable? By what signs can we distinguish the growing new from the declining old? The chief feature of this new culture, which may one day be called the age of the conquest of time, was not at first apparent. Just as the Renaissance, that age of the conquest of space, began not with the discovery of America, but with the invention of perspective drawing, which first enabled men accurately to project 3 spatial dimensions within 2. So this new epoch was ushered in by mechanical and philosophical novelties, whose real significance lay hidden in the future. Certainly the conquest of time is an anomaly, just as the conquest of space was. Nobody conquers either time or space. They represent, and always will represent, 2 different projections of our universe, the plan and elevation, as it were. And it is impossible to conquer either, as it is to conquer the surface of a table or an apple. Yet such surfaces can be studied, explored, penetrated, and their configuration permanently altered, as when one feels, pinches, and finally takes a bite out of the apple. And in this period, whose conception lay somewhere around the year 1865, men did indeed learn to explore time, understand time, and enter into a different relation to time from that which they had enjoyed before. Out of the innumerable inventions of this period, we need take only 3 to demonstrate this trend. In 1872, Edward Muybridge anticipated the moving picture by breaking up motion into constituent units with coordinated cameras which recorded the successive positions of racing horses. Hidden in this invention lay the possibility of putting these units of motion together again in different ways. That is, of reproducing events either faster or slower than they actually occur, or in reverse. In one blow, a technique was shown of breaking the illusion with which men had lived for thousands of years, that of a time flowing in one direction at a uniform speed. 4 years later, Alexander Graham Bell invented the microphone. And again, within this apparently simple invention lay the possibility of a single man addressing not hundreds, but millions of men simultaneously, of projecting his voice and presence all over the world without the mediation of time. Previously, human communication beyond earshot had been based on time. If a man wished to address large numbers of other men, he had to speak to a crowd in one place, then travel to a second place, speak there, move to a third place, and so on. Even if he wrote a book, the book had to be printed and copies conveyed to the places or countries where the readers lived. And all this meant time. A third invention, that of the phonograph by Edison in 1877, had the reverse effect. Before, sound waves vanished almost instantaneously with their production. There was no way of preserving them beyond the time they took to reverberate or echo, a half minute or so at most. Now, suddenly, sound could be preserved in the same way as visual images had for centuries been preserved. A speech delivered today could be exactly reproduced in 10 or 100 years. Time was suddenly introduced as dimension into phenomena where there had been no room for it before. There is, in fact, one definite condition of this change of man's relation to time, and this condition began to be discovered in the 60s of the 19th century. Mechanical motion implies time, whereas electromagnetic motion, in relation to human perception, is instantaneous. A wheelbarrow, for instance, can only exist in one place at one moment. The same light, on the other hand, can exist in many places simultaneously. Since the beginning of the world, men had been surrounded by phenomena of these 2 orders. But up to the 19th century, they had remained entirely distinct. The motion of a physical body could only be carried out mechanically and took time. The motion of a sensual impression, which depends on electromagnetic vibrations, was instantaneous and unpreservable. The seed inventions of the time age arose from the gradual discovery that mechanical motion and electromagnetic motion were interchangeable. By changing electromagnetic waves into mechanical motion, as in the cinema or phonograph, time was introduced where it had not entered before. By replacing mechanical motion by electromagnetic impulses, as in the radio or telephone, phenomena phenomena were made instantaneous, which previously could only be accomplished by the aid of time. The depth of philosophical, artistic, and scientific discoveries that transpired in the 19th century paved the way for a final reconciliation between the new knowledge of modern science and the ancient ideas of eternity and regeneration. As we have verified and explored in today's show, the past influence of esoteric schools on civilizations leaves no question. It is apparent that there had to have been a school actively influencing the 19th century's explosion of ideas and creativity also. Historical records indicate that this school was somewhere in Rome. Exactly what kind of school existed in Rome between 1800 and 1880, from which so many creative ideas of the New Age could emanate, we cannot know. Yet, in all its traces, we find the same understanding. Light as the one creative and unifying force of the universe, the octave as a modification of pure light into form and color, and time, recurrence, and the fulfillment of all possibilities as the 3 stages of man's ascent to the nature of light. So that if it be asked what is characteristic of the New Age and how may it be distinguished from the old, we can answer now. That which separates and divides belongs to the past. That which reconciles and unites belongs to the future. And the way towards unity lies through the escape from time.
We are currently in the synthetic age. This is the reason we can bring this program to you, where the transmission of ideas is through the medium of radio, cinema, and electromagnetic apparatuses. Our age is often called the age of the conquest of time, and this can be witnessed by early inventors and their inventions. 1900, Max Planck's quantum theory. 1905, Einstein's theory of relativity. 1908, the Wright brothers and their airplane. 1915, the cinema. 1920, the automobile. 1925, the radio. 1935, air transportation. 1939, the first television broadcast. 1944, the splitting of the atom. 1982, the Internet protocol was standardized. This clip from the movie The Matrix may be seen as the modern-day man's allegory of the cave.
I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice. Tumbling down the rabbit hole?
You could say that.
I can see it in your eyes. You have the look of a man who accepts what he sees because he is expecting to wake up. Ironically, this is not far from the truth. Do you believe in fate, Neo?
No,
Why not?
because I don't like the idea that I'm not in control of my life.
I know exactly what you mean. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. Do you know what I'm talking about?
The Matrix?
Do you want to know what it is? The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
What truth?
That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage. born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind. Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more. Follow me. Hey, Bach, are we online?
Almost.
Time is always against us.
Before we end the show today, I wanted to read something from Epictetus's Manual on Living, the Art of Living. The Soul's Cry. Philosophy's main task is to respond to the soul's cry, to make sense of and thereby free ourselves from the hold of our griefs and fears. Philosophy calls us when we've reached the end of our rope, the insistent feeling that something is not right with our lives, and the longing to be restored to our better selves will not go away. Our fears of death and being alone, our confusion about love and sex, and our sense of impotence in the face of our anger and outsized ambitions brings us to ask our first sincere philosophical questions. It's true. There is no obviously apparent meaning to our lives. Cruelty, injustice, bodily discomfort, illness, annoyances, and inconveniences, big and small, are the prosaic facts of any day. So what do we do about this? How do we, in spite of the pain and suffering in the outside world and our own wayward emotions, live ennobled lives rather than succumbing to a despairing numbness and merely coping like a mule with tedium and unbidden responsibilities? When the soul cries out, it is a sign that we have arrived at a necessary, mature stage of self-reflection. The secret is not to get stuck there, dithering or wringing your hands, but to move forward, resolving to heal yourself. Philosophy asks us to move into courage. Its remedy is the unblinking excavation of the faulty and specious premises on which we base our lives and our personal identity. Thank you for joining us at today's show. We look forward to seeing you next week here on SBN.